Alright, we are back, probably a bit of a day late to record our power rankings, considering we also have to turn around and do our pre-race for Austria real quick. But yeah, we are going to be talking about the Spanish Grand Prix, and the low bit Carlos Sainz there, we can kind of ignore that quality. But yeah, let's go ahead and talk about some racing. Alright, so as always, we are going to start at the bottom and work our way up. And this week, we do not have to put any asterisks by a single driver. We're going to, like, everyone finished. There isn't a single thing to put in. It's great. As much as I plan on talking about every driver every week from now on, yeah, it makes things easier that every driver actually finished the race. So down at the bottom, I put Yuki Tsunoda and Logan Sargent. So, yeah, Logan Sargent, I don't think really much needs to be said at this point. He's just been very disappointing overall. I don't think there isn't really anything that needs to be added at this point. Yuki Tsunoda, though, it was a pretty disappointing weekend for them. For V-Carb in general, so I don't think expectations were too high, but dang, he did really bad. He did really bad. I don't think that his team helped him by putting him on an extra stop strategy, although I didn't really see too much of his race to see if it was that he killed his own tires and that it was needed, maybe. I don't know. Maybe they were just trying something, but regardless, Tsunoda was not looking good. You would think with how much he was pushing on the tires to justify doing a third stop, he'd be able to catch up to Ricciardo, but he wasn't even close. Yeah. Next group of drivers, I've got Bottas, Ricciardo, Stroll, Magnussen, and Albon. So Albon, I kind of give him a little bit of grace here a bit because the Williams were just so bad. They were so bad, but at the same time, he also did take himself off the track. He kind of was really the only driver to really majorly mess up in the race. I know the argument could be made for Magnussen getting himself a couple penalties, but Albon's the only one who actually really impacted his race, and he was so far out of it that I don't think it even lost him a position. Maybe one position? I don't even know. Lance Stroll, this is kind of there. Aston weren't really competitive this week. So most of these drivers that are below the top 10, there isn't really much to talk about. This week was very much like everyone was on a very high or very low. There wasn't really much of an in-between. It's kind of weird. Yeah, Daniel Ricciardo, we kind of already talked about him a little bit. They were the second worst car this weekend, behind only Williams was worse. But the arguments could still be made at least against Sauber. Sauber hasn't been consistent enough to say if they're better or not yet. But Sauber had a good weekend, and Bottas had himself a decent qualifying, not as good of a race, but a decent qualifying at the very least, enough to justify putting him a little bit higher, outperforming the expectations of the car as they currently stand. The next group of drivers who I put in my mid-pack are Hülkenberg, Ocon, Zhou, Alonso, Piastri, and Sergio Perez. Like a couple of these drivers, Hülkenberg and Zhou, I'd say they just had pretty decent races. Their qualifying was still just kind of if anything, probably really good for Zhou. But then he just had himself a decent race. I don't think he really gained too many positions, ended up finishing P13. But a pretty solid race for him, especially considering he's actually still looking for a seat for next year. I think that was a solid drive. Hopefully he doesn't have to rely on his teammate getting out of his way next time, but still, a solid drive. Ocon, not much to say. That Alpine still hasn't really shown enough to justify that it deserves to be in the points, so I think that kind of boosts him and Gasly a little bit this week. But yeah, pretty solid performance. Oscar, very disappointing performance, just not really much to say to it. Butchered his Q3. And yeah, Sergio Perez, I predicted him to be like P7, P8. And even then, I remember thinking to myself, this is really bad for a Red Bull. And he perfectly met that expectation. So he's still doing like very bad in my opinion. Not as bad as he did in Canada, sure, but still very bad. At least he managed to get a couple points out of it, but yeah, it's tough. It's really, really tough to justify why the heck he got that contract. Next in my groupings, we got most of the front runners then. We got Hamilton, Leclerc, Russell, Sainz, Gasly. So yeah, Hamilton, pretty fantastic actually throughout most of the weekend. And like especially when comparing to George, I don't think George was actually bad at all. I think if maybe if he wasn't on that bad strategy, there's a chance he might have gotten that podium. But outside of that double overtake going into turn 1, I didn't really notice George as much this week. I think Hamilton actually outqualified him as well for like the first time in quite a while. Hamilton was just very good this weekend, in my opinion. We did briefly mention Gasly while talking about Ocon. It's basically the same points. This car isn't necessarily fully expected to be competing for points yet, so I think that's kind of boosting his numbers up a little bit. I'm sure as we get more and more, it'll kind of balance itself out. But for now, Gasly, that's still rated a very, very good race for him. The two Ferraris, I think they basically did as expected post-practice sessions. If I had been I did make predictions pre-weekend. I put them probably both each just a little slightly higher. I don't think that's really too disappointing. It's probably disappointing for them, but ultimately, I think they basically did as best as they could have when looking after all the practice sessions. Then finally, my top 2 drivers of the weekend, I got Norris Verstappen. Norris put it on pole and was very, very competitive all race long. And in my opinion, McLaren still don't have the best car. I still think that actually on paper right now it's probably Mercedes and Red Bull, but McLaren is kind of almost right there. It's not like it's a big giant gap or anything like that. But I think that gives Norris a little bit of an edge when he's finishing a very comfortable P2 with getting the fastest lap. I think he might have potentially had some of the fastest overall pace too. But yeah, he's expected to be competing for P3 at best, and he's getting a solid P2 and massively outperforming his teammate. Granted, Max did too, but Max is kind of expected to compete for the win. He's doing basically as expected. I think Norris is just ever so slightly exceeding his own expectations. I think that's what kind of put him up into number 1 for this week. So, of course, we will, as always, talk about my little weekly awards, driver of the day, worst driver, etc., etc. So my driver of the day I did put as Lando Norris, simply because that top overall rating, he had himself a fantastic weekend. Worst driver of the day I gave to Alex Albon. He's the only one who very badly impacted his race at all, going into the gravel at that one point. Best recovery, I put Carlos Sainz. This is not necessarily a best recovery mid-race. I'm thinking of it as a best recovery since last week. He took himself out of that race last week, and he had himself a decent weekend. Not necessarily anything to, I was going to say write home about, but considering he was at his home race, that kind of feels a little bit off, but he had himself a good turnaround. Driver that over-delivered, right now I put Lewis Hamilton because on paper still, yeah, he is kind of the one who exceeded the most as far as performance goes, but it's also kind of tough to judge because I think on paper they might have the best car, so he might have actually potentially under-delivered. I might be completely wrong on that one. And the driver who absolutely did under-deliver, in my opinion, Sergio Perez. He's expected to be competing for a win, definitely at the very least for a podium, and he's not even close. It's one thing if he was starting at the back of the grid and moved up to P8, but he qualified P8, started P11, and finished P8. It wasn't good. It wasn't good at all. Sergio, you gotta be doing better than that to justify that contract. It's crazy. Of course, we always look at our pre-weekend predictions and see how far off we were, so this was my quali prediction, and seeing where we were kind of off. The big difference, I would say, is the Alpines, the Saubers, and the V-Carbs. Everything else wasn't too far off, but it's just Alpine and Sauber were better than expected, and V-Carb were just simply awful this week. And, well, I would say I'm off a little bit about, of course, Alex Albon as well. I don't think anyone would expect him to be down that low, even with a bad Williams car. I think it's generally expected for him to at least be competing to get out of Q2, but he wasn't even close. But I think that's more or less because Williams wasn't even close. And then when I came to my pre-weekend race predictions, it's probably basically a lot of the same thing. Yeah. Well, actually, the Mercedes did better than expected. Ferrari did worse than expected. That's kind of on target. The Alpines did much better than expected. Aston's did not do as good. Sauber's did way better. I'd say VCarb did way worse, but I didn't actually have too high of expectations for Ricardo this weekend. But Tsunoda was massively disappointing. And yeah, that's kind of really it. So when it came time to give myself my little scorecard there, it was a 33.3. So not as good as I did in Canada, but not my worst performance. One of the worst performances, but not my worst quite yet. And then, of course, if people want to just take a look over my numbers, figure out how I got to my numbers, you can put it on pause, take a look over some of this information, and piece that all together. All right. Well, thank you very much for watching these videos. I believe that's the last slide for this. Yes, it absolutely is. If you are interested in any of my content, I will be doing one pre-weekend prediction for Austria coming up, and I'm also going to be dropping my mid-season rankings for the Formula 3 season, since Spain was the halfway point. So I'm going to be dropping that video probably tomorrow. I hope to see you all around. Let me know what you think. Take care.